11:51 p.m., my phone illuminated the dark room. A text from my father, "We have agreed." The sprawling estate they were standing in, the imported Italian marble, the crystal chandeliers, the luxury cars parked in the circular driveway, all of it was legally frozen. "You are a liability." Seconds later, my sister hearted the message. I rubbed my eyes. There was no panic, only sudden, absolute clarity. This was not a disownment. It was a targeted sabotage. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I did not cry. I did not ask why. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical and precise. I just opened my laptop, bypassed my personal folders, and pulled up my Securities and Exchange Commission auditor credentials. For my entire life, my family had designated me as the failure, the perpetual disappointment. I had worn that label in silence for 15 years because of a fundamental psychological trap, the scapegoat's burden. When a toxic family assigns you the role of the problem, they effectively hold your identity hostage. You stay silent, accepting the blame for their dysfunctions, because the fear of losing your family, even a cruel one, is paralyzing. You carry their sins, so the fragile family structure does not collapse under its own weight. But tonight, the structure had unilaterally terminated my contract. I was no longer bound by their non-disclosure agreement. I bypassed the standard employee portal and accessed the internal server logs for my father's investment firm. If they were cutting me off at midnight on a Saturday, they were hiding something deep in the ledger. This was not an emotional breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and I needed to verify the assets. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, tracing the digital footprints of the firm's recent transactions. I slipped past the initial encrypted layers and pulled the raw access logs. It took less than 12 minutes to find the anomaly. A massive, unauthorized transfer of $1.4 million had been routed to an offshore shell account earlier that afternoon. But it was not the amount that made my blood run cold. It was the authorization signature. The digital credentials attached to the fraudulent transfer belonged to me. Specifically, they belonged to an old, restricted intern profile I had used back in 2013 when I was 22 years old, and still desperately trying to earn my father's approval. He had kept those credentials active on a hidden server. He had authorized an illegal, devastating financial crime using my name. This was why they were locking me out. They were not just discarding a daughter, they were framing a federal auditor. The failure they had mocked at every dinner table was about to take the fall for a multi-million-dollar felony. They thought I would panic, fold, and accept the blame, just like I always did. They thought I was still the silent investor in their twisted version of a family, endlessly paying the subscription fee for their conditional love. They were banking on my predictable, emotional compliance. But they forgot one crucial detail. I was no longer the desperate intern seeking a father's validation. I was a senior compliance auditor for the federal government. My entire career was built on dismantling financial illusions and uncovering the truth buried in the metadata. And the data right in front of me was a signed confession. This was not revenge. It was simply accounting. The narrative of my supposed failure was a masterpiece of corporate gaslighting. For 15 years, my father, Brian, had cultivated a very specific public image. He was the brilliant investment portfolio manager, the self-made patriarch who could turn lead into gold, was treated like an insignificant mid-level analyst, the daughter who just could not quite measure up to the family standard. But the private ledgers told a completely different story. I leaned back in my desk chair, staring at the glowing screen as the stark memories of 2018 surfaced. That was the year the firm hit a massive, catastrophic liquidity crisis. Brian had over-leveraged the company's assets on a series of disastrous real estate gambles. The firm was exactly 3 weeks away from total insolvency. I did not ask for recognition when I quietly liquidated my own modest stock portfolio and took out a massive personal loan to secretly cover his margins. I transferred $374,000 to keep his business afloat, masking it entirely as an anonymous angel investment through a proxy trust. I saved his empire from total collapse, and in return, I kept my silence. My life became an exercise in extreme austerity. I lived in a 400 square foot apartment with faulty heating, drove a 12-year-old sedan that rattled on the highway, and budgeted every grocery trip down to the exact penny. I did this to manage the crushing debt I had taken on to save him. Meanwhile, Brian used the newly stabilized firm to fund an increasingly lavish lifestyle. The contrast was never sharper than at his opulent monthly dinner parties. I would sit at a massive mahogany table covered in crystal glassware and imported linens, wearing a tailored suit I had bought at a discount outlet. Brian would pour $300 bottles of wine and hold court, loudly lamenting my lack of ambition to his wealthy colleagues. He would gesture toward me with his wine glass, chuckling as he told the table that some people just lack the killer instinct required for real financial success. I would sit there, quietly sipping ice water, knowing that the very wine he was drinking had been subsidized by my empty bank account. The transactional abuse did not stop at his business debts. When my grandmother Evelyn fell ill a few years later, Brian claimed his assets were entirely tied up in illiquid investments. He told the family we would have to place her in a substandard state facility. I refused to let that happen. I took on weekend consulting contracts, working 80-hour weeks to personally fund her high-end medical care and private nursing staff. I paid for her dignity while Brian bought a new luxury sports car and took his socialite wife, Karen, on a month-long vacation to the Amalfi Coast. He diverted the family trust funds meant for Evelyn's care directly into his personal checking account, perfectly confident that I would silently cover the deficit. I was footing the bill for their entire existence, and they were charging me an emotional tax for the privilege. I had been subsidizing my own humiliation for over a decade. But looking at the fraudulent transfer logs on my screen tonight, the transaction was finally complete. The account was closed. At 8 o'clock the next morning, my phone buzzed with an automated alert from LinkedIn. It was a public post from Brian, broadcasted to his thousands of professional connections across the financial sector. Proud of the firm's resilience, the post read. We have recently navigated a difficult internal audit regarding a junior staffer's gross negligence. It is a harsh reminder that loyalty must never compromise professional integrity. We are moving forward, stronger and more transparent than ever. I stared at the screen, my expression completely flat. He was moving swiftly to control the market perception. By publicly labeling me the negligent junior staffer before the weekend was even over, he was preemptively destroying my credibility. If I tried to speak out now, I would look like a bitter, fired employee spinning wild accusations to cover her own incompetence. 10 minutes later, an overnight courier knocked loudly on my door, handing me a heavy, certified envelope. Inside was a formal termination letter from the firm's human resources department. It was printed on thick, expensive cardstock, citing gross incompetence, severe compliance violations, and breach of fiduciary duty as the cause for my immediate dismissal. It explicitly stated that the firm reserved the right to pursue severe legal action for the financial damages I had supposedly caused to their clients. I held the crisp paper in my hand, feeling its physical weight. It was a tangible artifact of intimidation, carefully designed to crush me into submission. But compared to the digital evidence currently sitting on my encrypted hard drive, it was utterly weightless. It was just paper, easily shredded, easily burned. This public execution was a classic deployment of the illusion of family unity. In highly toxic, image-obsessed families, unity is never about actual love or support. It is a carefully manufactured brand. The patriarch acts as the chief executive of this brand, and any member who threatens the public image must be aggressively discredited and excised. Brian was publicly sacrificing me on the altar of his own reputation, utilizing the universally respected concept of corporate integrity to mask a targeted assassination. He was framing himself as the principled leader, making a tough call for the good of the company, effectively gaslighting an entire professional network. It was a brilliant tactical maneuver, completely devoid of human empathy. He had weaponized our biological connection to make his corporate narrative untouchable. He assumed that the heavy cardstock of the termination letter and the public shame of his social media post would send me into a spiral of panic and despair. He expected me to hide in my apartment, paralyzed by the sheer scale of his preemptive strike, too terrified to mount any kind of defense. I did not hide. I did not draft a desperate, emotional reply to his post. I walked over to my desk, set the heavy termination letter down next to my laptop, and pulled a blank, encrypted thumb drive from my locked drawer. The time for silent investments had passed. It was time to initiate a hostile takeover. Monday morning arrived with a sharp, biting chill in the air. I walked into the regional headquarters of the Securities and Exchange Commission at precisely 8:45 a.m. The building was a massive fortress of glass and steel, echoing with the low, steady hum of federal authority. I badged through the security checkpoints, my face a mask of absolute neutrality. I was not walking into this building as a discarded daughter seeking sympathy. I was entering as a senior federal auditor executing her duties. I bypassed my usual cubicle on the fourth floor and walked directly to the corner office of the regional director, Marcus. He was a veteran financial investigator, a man who saw the world purely in numbers, spreadsheets, and rigid regulatory statutes. I closed his heavy glass door behind me and sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. I did not offer any morning pleasantries or small talk. I simply reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the encrypted thumb drive, and slid it across the polished mahogany surface. I need you to initiate an immediate, full-scale forensic review of this data, I said, my voice perfectly level. It contains the complete audit trail, internal routing logs, and forged authorization signatures for a $1.48 million embezzlement scheme originating directly from my father's firm. Marcus looked at the drive, then up at me, his brow heavily furrowed in concern. Your father's firm? Maya, are you sure about this? It is a massive conflict of interest for you to be personally involved in this investigation. I am not involved in the investigation, I replied clinically, maintaining absolute eye contact. I am the primary whistleblower submitting irrefutable evidence of a federal crime. The logs will clearly show that my inactive intern credentials from a decade ago were manipulated to authorize the illegal transfer. I am officially requesting a forensic trace on the originating IP addresses. As Marcus plugged the drive into his secure terminal, my mind briefly drifted to the stark contrast between my two worlds. Childhood betrayals are warm and messy. They are filled with shouting, slammed doors, bitter tears, and endless emotional manipulation. But my professional world was beautifully cold and clinical. In this room, there were no emotional taxes to pay, no conditional love to earn, and no psychological gaslighting to navigate. There was only raw data, regulatory compliance, and the unforgiving architecture of federal law. My family had relied on the messy warmth of familial guilt to keep me compliant for 15 years. They had absolutely no defense against the freezing, absolute zero temperature of objective evidence. This was not a petty family dispute anymore. It was a highly prioritized federal inquiry. The emotional bonds had been fully liquidated, and all that remained was a rigid, unbreakable chain of digital custody. I watched the progress bar on Marcus's screen slowly fill as the data decrypted. The silent investor was finally speaking. I sat in absolute silence for 45 minutes while Marcus and his lead forensic technician ran the initial diagnostic sweep on the decrypted data. The only sound in the sprawling corner office was the rapid, methodical clicking of keyboards and the low hum of the secure federal servers processing the files. Finally, the technician leaned back in his chair, pulling up a highly detailed mapped projection on the primary monitor. We have a confirmed match on the routing protocols, Marcus said, his professional detachment entirely replacing any lingering personal concern. The $1.48 million transfer was indeed authorized, using your legacy credentials. But the geo-tracking paints a very specific, undeniable picture. The technician had successfully traced the digital fingerprint of the fraudulent transaction back to its exact point of origin. You were right, the routing protocols match perfectly, Marcus said, his professional detachment entirely replacing any lingering personal concern. The $1.48 million transfer was indeed authorized using your legacy credentials, but the geo-tracking paints a very specific, undeniable picture. He rotated the heavy monitor toward me. The IP addresses used to execute the illegal trades did not originate from the firm's corporate servers in Manhattan, as one might expect. Instead, they traced directly back to a private, heavily encrypted server located at a residential address. It was the Connecticut estate. My father had not just forged my digital signature to steal from his clients. He had executed the entire embezzlement scheme from the comfort of his home office. Utilizing the estate's private residential network, he had been so incredibly arrogant, so perfectly convinced of his own untouchable invulnerability, that he assumed I would never have the technical clearance or the audacity to access the deep-level routing logs. A sudden, razor-sharp memory flashed in my mind. I was 22 years old, sitting nervously in that exact home office at the Connecticut estate. Brian had tossed a heavy laptop onto my lap and instructed me to set up the new intern credentials for the firm's main database. I had spent hours carefully configuring the access permissions, desperate to prove my competence, eager for a single word of praise that never came. I had left those credentials in the system, a forgotten artifact of my own eagerness to please. 10 years later, he had picked up that forgotten artifact and turned it into a lethal weapon. He had dusted off the digital ghost of my 22-year-old self and used it to bury the 33-year-old woman I had become. It was a brilliant sociopathic strategy, but his fatal error was executing the strike from his own fortress, leaving a trail leading straight to his front door. "We have enough concrete evidence to freeze the firm's assets immediately," Marcus stated, breaking through my thoughts. But given the residential origin of the IP address, this extends far beyond standard corporate liability. We are looking at personal asset seizure. I looked at the glowing map on the screen. The sprawling Connecticut estate, the site of so many opulent dinners and quiet humiliations, was now ground zero for a federal raid. "We have everything we need to secure approval from the federal judge," I stated coldly. "Let's push through the emergency asset freeze and get the residential warrants signed." The accounting was almost finished. It was time to collect the debt. The climax of my father's carefully constructed reality took place on a crisp Thursday evening at the Connecticut estate. Brian was hosting his annual autumn gala, a lavish, meticulously planned event designed to showcase his immense wealth and secure new, high-net-worth investors. He was operating under the deeply arrogant assumption that his public LinkedIn post and my swift, brutal termination had effectively neutralized any threat I posed. He fully expected the Securities and Exchange Commission to treat any noise I made as the desperate flailing of a disgruntled junior staffer, a nuisance easily buried under his massive corporate influence. He was operating under the deeply arrogant assumption that his public LinkedIn post and my swift, brutal termination had effectively neutralized any threat I posed to his Manhattan empire. At 8:15 p.m., the heavy oak double doors of the estate swung open. I did not walk in as the disappointing daughter or the failure who wore discount suits to blend into the background. I walked in flanked by Marcus, 2 armed federal agents, and a specialized team of forensic accountants. I stepped into the grand marble foyer, not as family, but as the primary witness for the federal prosecution. The prestigious string quartet playing in the corner immediately faltered, the classical music dying out in a discordant scrape of bows. The low, sophisticated murmur of wealthy guests chatting over crystal flutes of imported champagne evaporated into absolute, suffocating silence. I locked eyes with Brian across the expansive marble floor. He was holding a glass of vintage champagne, caught mid-laugh with a prospective billionaire client. I watched the precise, microscopic moment his entire reality shattered. The arrogant, untouchable smirk slid completely off his face, replaced by a sudden, hollow panic that widened his eyes. His face crumbled, aging 10 years in 10 seconds, as his brain processed the federal badges surrounding me. He was not looking at a scared, submissive scapegoat anymore. He was looking at his own personal extinction event. His socialite wife, Karen, rushed frantically to his side, her heavy diamond necklace catching the brilliant chandelier light. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shrill with indignation and confusion. "Brian, call security right now." "There is no security to call, Karen," I said, my voice echoing with clinical precision through the silent foyer. "The firm's operating accounts have been permanently suspended. The assets are locked." I watched her eyes dart wildly from the federal agents to Brian's ashen, terrified face, and then to the opulent surroundings. The sensory contrast in the room was absolute and poetic. The sprawling estate they were standing in, the imported Italian marble, the crystal chandeliers, the luxury cars parked in the circular driveway, All of it was legally frozen. It was entirely gone. The Grand Gala had instantly transformed into an active crime scene. I did not feel triumphant, and I certainly did not feel pity. I just felt the quiet, clinical satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. The final sequence of events was incredibly swift and entirely bureaucratic. Brian was escorted out of the grand estate by the armed federal agents, his hands cuffed tightly in front of him by the US Marshals, his tailored designer suit suddenly looking absurdly out of place. He did not look back at me, and I did not offer a single word of goodbye. The transaction was over. An hour later, the estate was cleared of all guests and formally cordoned off with federal tape. I walked out to the back of the massive property and sat down on a cold stone bench in what used to be my grandmother Evelyn's garden. The night air was quiet and still, and for the first time in my entire life, my chest felt completely clear. The heavy, invisible weight of expectation and forced loyalty had vanished into the darkness. I was finally, irrevocably free. I've come to realize that we are deeply conditioned to believe in a debt of blood. Society dictates that because we share a name, a history, or genetics with someone, we owe them our endless endurance. We are told to quietly absorb their toxicity, to continually finance their emotional and sometimes literal deficits, all in the holy name of family. But loyalty is not a suicide pact. You do not owe anyone your life, your sanity, or your future just because you happen to share their DNA. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiving someone does not mean you have to keep them in your life. If you ever find yourself trapped in a dynamic where your worth is constantly diminished, start building your own audit trail immediately. Build a digital one. Secure your personal finances. Protect your independence and document your absolute truth. But more importantly, build an emotional audit trail. Recognize your own inherent value completely outside of their warped ledgers. Cut the toxic ties that are bleeding you dry, because at the end of the day, boundaries are the only wealth that truly matters. If you've ever had to cut ties to save yourself, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below, you aren't alone in this. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice.